Danny Kelly joins us talking fantasy football. Danny, good morning. It's Dave. It's Kyle. It's Jay. How are you?
I'm doing well. I was just actually perusing this list. Living La Vida Loca at number 40. Wow. That is a way back track.
That feels way too low.
Yeah.
This is where the consultants get on me because we could just go on a complete detour. And I'm not doing.
No, don't do it. This
But
is football.
can I say one thing?
No,
And
we're men.
I
We talk
promise it's
football.
one thing. I will say Ricky Martin. Okay, his performance at the Grammys when he did the whatever the World Cup song was, that Ole 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 song, completely changed the musical landscape and opened up the door for a lot of brand new Latin artists to come in. That wasn't Living La Vida Loca, that wasn't the video, but you could argue that Ricky Martin was no doubt the most influential artist of 1999, Danny Kelly.
Wow.
Thank you.
I mean, that sounds like a standalone column right there.
Go check out the Ringer.
Maybe pitch that, yeah.
Check out Ringer.com and check out their Twitter account if you want to go down a rabbit hole and get completely distracted from whatever you're doing. We're going to talk to Danny, though, about fantasy football. One of the questions I was going to write down to ask you was, hey, Danny, who's number one pick this year? But I'm going to ask it this way. Danny, how often when you're doing interviews and talking to people is their first question, who's going to be the number one pick this year? I feel like that happens a lot.
I mean, yeah, it's a big question, and I think it's a valid one because, there's no clear-cut number one guy. I think any of those top four guys, the Barkley, McCaffrey, Elliott, Kamara, I think you could easily make an argument to take them number one. I've sort of just been doing diversify your stock market type thing. I've just kind of been alternating between all four of them because I truly don't have a favorite. I think Barkley maybe by a hair, but I think you can also, make arguments McCaffrey and PPR and Kamara and PPR, Elliott and standard. I think there's just, you could visualize any of those guys ending up being the number one, overall scorer in fantasy football. So to me, there's really no wrong answer, which makes it kind of easier for me.
Well, and so you mentioned Kamara, you mentioned Saquon Barkley, et cetera. I did not hear Le'Veon Bell and Todd Gurley in there, and that brings me to my next question. We were talking earlier about you coming on and talking about the dilemma that a lot of owners are going to have. There's questions about Todd Gurley's health. There's questions about Le'Veon Bell being a year older and playing for the New York Jets. Let me ask you kind of a three-pronged question. Gurley, Bell, and James Conner in Pittsburgh. Are those three the more interesting and perhaps confusing picks for you as far as where to slot them? Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. I think Bell is one of those guys that he's like a sneaky top 5 guy, but he could also, you could also see him falling out of the top 10, out of the top 12 overall in scoring just because the Jets offense might not be very good at all. And we haven't seen him for a year. Obviously, he's posting some videos where he looks like he's in pretty good shape, but it's just there's so many question marks around him. I think when you're talking about Todd Gurley, it seems pretty clear that his workload is going to be significantly decreased, which will hurt his fantasy bottom line. Now is 65% of his total from the last couple of years. That's still a very, very good number. But are you taking him in the first round over some of these guys that have potentially more, they're going to play more snaps, they're going to get more carries, all that. You don't have to worry quite as much with those guys down the stretch potentially. So Gurley is a big question mark. I'm a huge Henderson fan too, so I think that they're going to definitely have kind of a timeshare in LA going forward, and that's going to hurt Gurley's overall, bottom line. And then Connor, I think, is another interesting one because there's been talk of, the Steelers kind of alternating snaps between him and Jalen Samuels. Last year, the Steelers were super pass-heavy, and I think Connor actually scored touchdowns at a rate higher than expected, so maybe he's due for a little bit of a regression there. On the other hand, if Steelers go a little more run-heavy, he could end up having more carries and a bigger part of the, bigger piece of the pie. So, like you said, they're all kind of confusing. I think you have to just kind of, close your eyes and hope for the best with those guys because it's just really no telling, how good they're going to be. I will say all three of those guys are a small group of running backs in the NFL who still have sort of that, quote, bell cow status. And so, I think taking them in the first 2 rounds is kind of a no-brainer. Even if you're waiting a little bit to get Todd Gurley in the middle of the second round, I think that's still potentially a value just based on, getting even 65% or whatever. That's what Charles Robinson said that McVay is kind of aiming for, 65-35 split. I think even that he's going to be like a potential RB1. So, it's sort of scary taking those guys, but at the same time they have immense upside still.
Hey, with Danny Kelly, he's a writer at The Ringer. He's also part of the Fantasy Football Podcast. You can find that on the Ringer Podcast Network. Danny, I want to zoom out a little bit because we're talking a lot about running backs and their value in the draft. It felt like when I first started playing fantasy football in the late 2000s, it was all running backs. It was that's who you wanted to get in the first round, and then it kind of shifted toward receivers as the league became more pass heavy. But now we're starting to see kind of more spread concepts on offense, and it seems like the balance is shifting back toward running backs. Have you noticed any major changes in the way fantasy football is played or viewed as kind of this offensive, I guess, evolution takes place in the NFL?
Yeah, I mean, so it kind of depends on what settings you're playing on. In PPR, I think running backs are becoming more important. Their running back targets have gone up over the last few years, and I think that trend is just going to continue. They're kind of eating into the overall tight end volume. And so as teams use their running backs and as pass catcher out of the backfield, that obviously has a fantasy impact. You get some of the top pass-catching backs, obviously, like James White is the guy who comes to mind. I think he had 7 receiving touchdowns last year. So you can get those kind of guys in the middle of the draft, I guess, like in the 50s and 60s, like James White, Tariq Cohen, pass-catching guys that give you sort of that upside in PPR leagues. I think that's kind of where you're finding value with the running back position, because if you don't get one of the, quote, bell cow guys in the first 2 rounds, there's a lot of past that. There's a lot of sort of handcuff guys and running back by committee guys. So it's a little bit more dicey when you're talking about weekly starts. But the ability for some of these guys to be factors in the passing game, I think, is what kind of gives them upside. So that's to me where you can find value in the middle part of the rounds when you're looking for that running back 2 or 3. I think that's kind of what you have to look at, like the pass catching ability. So it's definitely changing. I think it's going to continue to go in that direction.
Danny, want to switch over to the quarterback position for a little bit? I know you just did a podcast on this. Is there any quarterbacks that you see on the top of a lot of people's boards that you would absolutely avoid?
Well, it's kind of a tricky question. Again, it depends on what format you're in. If you're in a 2-quarterback league, I think really any of these guys is going to be kind of an attraction. The guy in like 1-quarterback leagues that I'm probably going to be avoiding, well, there's 2 guys, Andrew Luck and Aaron Rodgers. And you could even say Mahomes just because right now his overall ADP is 21. So, there's kind of the threat that he could regress a little bit. And are you really getting the best value by taking that guy at 21 when you're going to be passing up some of these elite receivers or running backs or tight ends? So, really, in 1-quarterback leagues, I'm kind of avoiding all of the top guys. I guess the top 5 or 6 guys, and kind of waiting a little bit longer. In 2-quarterback leagues, I think, it's a little bit different because those guys become much more valuable. I think Andrew Luck and Mahomes both kind of have this the threat to regress a little bit based on last year. I mean, Luck was more efficient last year than any season in his career. His sack rate was at an all-time low. I think his touchdown rate was above his career average. So there's some signs there that you could see a slight regression, and he might not pay off on his ADP. I think Aaron Rodgers right now, he's quarterback 3. He's going 51st overall on average, and I think there's a chance too with him that just this new offense doesn't really work out. The Packers didn't do a whole lot at the receiver position to kind of bolster that and give him more weapons, and so there's a lot of question marks there in Rodgers too. I think just based on his ADP, based on how high Luck and Rodgers are right now, I think I'm passing on those guys and kind of waiting a little bit longer to target Dak Prescott, Philip Rivers of the world in the middle part of the draft instead.
Danny Kelly of The Ringer joining us talking fantasy football. You can go to ringer.com. We'll throw out Danny's Twitter account here as we wrap up so you can keep up to date on everything. I want to go back a little bit. You mentioned when talking about quarterbacks, Danny, 2-quarterback leagues. We were having this discussion before you came on. I am a huge proponent of 2-quarterback leagues. I hate the idea of having, in a 10-man league, having 2/3 of there's so much trouble, figuring out what running backs get and what carries with what coach. You have this quarterback that's going to play every game, all game, if he's not hurt, likely, and you have 2/3 of them sitting. Do you think, first off, are you a fan of 2-quarterback leagues? Secondly, do you think that's something that other fantasy owners around the country, A, are waking up to, and B, need to wake up to more?
I'm a huge proponent of 2-quarterback leagues. I think it's truly what I've started almost exclusively playing, like in terms of like for enjoyment. I think I have to play kind of all formats for my job. But like for my personal leagues, I really enjoy 2 quarterback leagues just because, number one, like you said, the quarterback position is the most important position bar none in football, maybe in sports. And the fact is, if you're playing a 1 quarterback league, quarterbacks are not important. You can take a quarterback in the middle or the late round,
yep,
and you can still have a very competitive team, which just seems backwards to me. I think I'll put it this way. I really like super flex leagues because in 2 quarterback leagues, they can really kind of get you into a jam during some of the bye weeks. In super flex leagues, you can start a quarterback in that super flex spot if you have an injury over that position that you're not totally screwed for your team. But I just really, really like the idea of having to invest a little bit earlier in quarterbacks. You kind of have to do a little bit more research on quarterbacks. You have to, and really, in 2 quarterback leagues or super flex leagues, if you have 2 dominant quarterbacks, your team can be just a complete juggernaut. So I think that just matches real football a little bit more. It just feels a little bit more, I guess, right or whatever. I'm not really sure how to put it, but I really enjoy it. I think it adds another element to kind of how you strategize in your draft. How you approach building your team. It's just kind of a new wrinkle that I think is gaining some popularity, and I really, really enjoy it. I think it's basically the way that I've kind of set up all my own personal leagues going forward. I just think it's much more fun and much more challenging.
Danny, you say all your own personal leagues. How many leagues are you in, or how many teams do you have?
I think it's funny because I add like 2 or 3 every year. I'm probably in right now like 12 different leagues. And some of those to me are sort of just like I'm doing this to add sort of market research or whatever for my job.
Yeah.
But I mean, some of them are definitely just like, hey, if you have an opening, let me in because I'm just trying to like consume as much fantasy football as possible. So it's risen exponentially over the last few years.
So are there just leagues where you kind of take flyers on guys because you just kind of want to see how it works out, having certain combinations of guys? And the people in that league is like, wow, Danny's really bad at this. Like, he tries to make all these crazy moves, and they never work.
I wouldn't say that I go, like, too crazy. I typically stick to ADP, kind of. But I will say I definitely try and diversify my teams because I think, like you said, it's kind of good to have the concept of what all these different players are doing. I don't want to have the same team, like, 7 or 8 times. And so... Right. I definitely keep that in mind, and when I'm drafting, I'm like, I don't have this guy in any other teams. I should see how this goes. I don't know if that's necessarily the best way to go about it, but for my job, it's kind of good because I kind of get a better idea of how everyone's doing throughout the year and things like that. So we'll see how that works out for me.
You can tell who the pro is because I'm in 3 leagues, and in all my 3 leagues, I try to make them as the same team in all 3 leagues.
Same.
I need to know who to root for, right? Like I draft the same guys. I'm either going to win a lot or I'm going to lose a lot. Danny Kelly with the Ringer joining us right now. Let's back up a second. You know, in our business, be it radio, TV, print, I think sometimes we're so ensconced, there's a word, in what we do, that we forget that not everybody plays and not everybody has played before. So let me ask you a very basic question, Danny. With drafts coming up here over the next month, to those that are either brand new or maybe in their 2nd or 3rd year of playing fantasy football, heading into a draft, what's your quick sheet recommendation for newer players to try to do their draft prep correctly?
Well, I would say...
Other than read Danny Kelly, sorry. Other than that.
I heard someone say this, and I'm going to probably butcher this, but I think someone said the only way you can lose the draft is if you miss on guys early, and you can win the draft when you hit on guys late.
Yep.
So basically what that means is don't get too crazy in the first couple of rounds. Stick to ADP. If you don't know what that is, it's the average draft position. You can find it on multiple sites. I'm looking at fantasypros.com right now. That's basically just an aggregation of a bunch of different drafts, mock drafts and real drafts over the last few months. And it kind of just tells you what the market is on all these players. Stick close-ish to ADP in the first couple of rounds because there's an enormous amount of opportunity costs in those first couple of rounds. If you miss on that guy in your first-round pick, it potentially could sink your entire season because those guys are your cash cows or whatever in terms of
Le'Veon Bell last year. If you miss on him, yeah.
Exactly. So, and then later in the draft, that's when you can kind of start taking some dart throws and going with guys you got a good feeling about and that kind of thing. And you know, that's kind of how you end up finding very good value later. So, that plus big picture, I think you've got to get your bell cow backs early. You know, I think there's certainly some, like we talked about earlier, certainly some pass catching backs later, but I think if you wait too long on running backs, you could put yourself in a bad situation. And then I'd say wait, if you're in a one quarterback league, wait on quarterbacks, and then wait on tight ends. If you miss out on the top 3 tight ends, I think I'd just wait until the late rounds to grab a guy.
Does Le'Veon Bell's season last year change the way you approach Ezekiel Elliott if you're drafting and he's still holding out?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of that fear in the back of your mind. But at the same time, I don't think I'm passing on Elliott necessarily. Like, if I'm sitting there at number 4 and Elliott's there, I'm certainly not passing on him. If I'm sitting there at number 2 or 3, I might probably go with Kamara or McCaffrey or, you know, Saquon if he falls. But if I'm sitting there at number 4 and Elliott's there, I don't think I'm ready to quite pass on him yet. I think with him under contract for another, you know, I think he's still under contract this year plus next year with a 5th-year option. Then they can franchise tag him potentially for 2 more years. I don't think he can hold out for 4 years, you know, so I don't know how that's going to go, but I just I see things, you know, progressing towards he's going to be on the field this year, in my opinion. So, but yeah, I'm not quite as scared about that as I was with Le'Veon Bell. It's a slightly different situation. Obviously, he's been franchise tagged a couple of times, and so at a different point in his, I guess, like his contract life.
Danny Kelly of The Ringer. We will talk to him if he'll allow us throughout the years. We did last year. Staff writer for The Ringer. He covers the NFL, fantasy, and, of course, all things draft and small. Go ahead and check out his podcast as well. And follow him on Twitter, at Danny B as in boy, at Danny B. Kelly. Danny, thank you. Always appreciate your time. We know you're busy.
Anytime. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
All right, take care. That's Danny Kelly.
The Drive.